The mountain wind carried the scent of pine and blood to the timber camp that morning, and Magnus Thornwood knew before the foreman's whistle blew that someone had died. He stood motionless among the towering ponderosa pines, his axe suspended mid-swing, watching the chaos unfold 200 yards downslope, where the logging crews worked the steeper grades. Men were running, shouting, their voices thin and desperate against the vastness of the Montana wilderness. Magnus didn't run. At 6 feet 8 inches tall, and weighing close to 300 pounds, he'd learned long ago that his size made people nervous when he moved too quickly. Instead, he set down his axe with deliberate care and walked toward the commotion with measured steps, his callous hands hanging loose at his sides. If you're drawn to stories of unexpected connections and the courage it takes to show our true selves, consider subscribing. There's more to unfold here. The accident site was chaos. A massive lodgepole pine had kicked back during the fall, catching Thomas Hartwell square in the chest and driving him 15 feet backward into a granite outcropping. Magnus arrived to find the camp doctor already kneeling beside the broken body, his face grave as he checked for signs of life that everyone present knew were gone. Thomas's eyes were open, staring at nothing, a thin trail of blood running from the corner of his mouth. He'd been 32 years old, married 8 years, father to 2 children under the age of 7. Magnus had shared a bunkhouse with him the previous winter and knew Thomas sang old hymns while he worked and saved every penny to buy his family a proper house in town. The foreman, a grizzled man named Callahan with more tobacco stained than teeth, pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Someone's got to tell Clara," he said to no one in particular. His eyes scanned the gathered men, all of whom suddenly found the ground fascinating. Magnus felt the familiar weight of expectations settle on his shoulders. They always looked to him for the hard jobs, the ones requiring strength and silence. He could fell a tree in half the time of any other logger. He could carry loads that required 3 ordinary men. But this required words, emotion, human connection, everything Magnus had spent his adult life avoiding. "I'll go," Magnus heard himself say, his voice a low rumble that seemed to rise from somewhere deep in the earth. The men looked relieved, grateful they wouldn't have to face a newly made widow themselves. Callahan nodded and clapped Magnus on the shoulder, the gesture awkward given their height difference. The camp doctor wrapped Thomas's body in canvas while Magnus stood apart, his massive frame casting long shadows in the morning sun that filtered through the pine canopy. The ride into Copper Ridge took 2 hours on horseback. Magnus rode a draft horse named Goliath, one of few animals strong enough to carry him comfortably. The town materialized gradually from the prairie, a collection of weathered buildings huddled together against the immensity of the landscape. False-fronted stores lined the main street. The saloon, the general store, the assayer's office, the hotel, all the necessary components of a frontier town clinging to existence through sheer stubbornness. Magnus knew where the Hartwell family lived, a small house on the eastern edge of town that Thomas had rented with hopes of eventually buying. He'd talked about it constantly, about the garden Clara wanted to plant, about teaching his son to read in the front room, about adding a second bedroom, so the children wouldn't have to share. Magnus tied Goliath to the fence post and stood in the street for a long moment, trying to arrange his thoughts into something coherent. He'd practiced what to say during the entire ride, but the words felt clumsy and insufficient. How did you tell someone their entire world had just collapsed? How did you quantify the loss of a husband, a father, a future? Magnus removed his hat and approached the front door, his boots heavy on the wooden porch. He raised his hand to knock, hesitated, then forced himself to follow through. The sound seemed too loud, too harsh. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 20s with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and green eyes that held a cautious intelligence. Clara Hartwell wore a simple cotton dress and an apron dusted with flour. She'd been baking. Magnus could smell fresh bread from inside the house and the normalcy of it, the absolute ordinariness of a woman baking bread while her husband lay dead in a mountain camp, made something twist painfully in his chest. Clara looked up at Magnus, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern as she registered his size, his somber expression, the hat he held crushed in his enormous hands. "Mrs. Hartwell," Magnus began, then stopped. His throat felt too tight. The words he'd rehearsed dissolved like morning fog. Clara's face went pale. She gripped the doorframe with one hand, her knuckles whitening, and Magnus realized she already knew. Women always knew. There was some instinct, some terrible intuition that prepared them for news like this. "It's Thomas, isn't it?" she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Magnus nodded, unable to force sound past the obstruction in his throat. There was an accident this morning. A tree. He didn't suffer, Mrs. Hartwell. It was quick. Clara didn't cry. She didn't collapse or scream or do any of the things Magnus had braced himself for. Instead, she seemed to fold inward, becoming smaller and more distant even as she stood directly in front of him. "I see," she said, her voice hollow. "Thank you for coming to tell me." She started to close the door, a reflexive action, a need to process this information in private. Magnus wanted to say something else, something comforting or helpful, but what could he possibly offer? He was a man who worked with his hands and his back, who understood the mechanics of timber and terrain, but nothing of human grief. So he simply nodded again and stepped back, allowing Clara the dignity of her privacy. As Magnus turned to leave, he heard a child's voice from inside the house asking Mama, who was at the door, and the sound of Clara's carefully controlled response. Magnus untied Goliath and mounted up, but he didn't ride away immediately. Instead, he sat astride the massive horse and looked back at the small house with its curtained windows and neat front garden. He thought about Thomas, about the man's dreams for his family, about the future that would now never materialize. And Magnus made a decision, the kind that would change the trajectory of his carefully isolated life. He would help Clara Hartwell, not openly, because that would invite questions and expectations Magnus couldn't meet, but quietly, in the ways a man with the particular skills could help. It wasn't much. It wouldn't bring Thomas back or ease Clara's grief, but it was something. And for Magnus, who'd spent most of his life feeling like he had nothing of value to offer anyone, something felt like a start. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountain passes with a vengeance that caught even the old-timers by surprise. By mid-October, snow lay thick on the ground, and the timber camps had shut down operations until spring thaw. Magnus found himself in Copper Ridge with the rest of the displaced loggers, men who drank away their wages and played cards in a saloon while waiting for weather that would allow them back into the mountains. Magnus rented a room above the livery stable, a space barely large enough for his frame, but private and quiet. He spent his days doing odd jobs around town, repairing roofs and chopping firewood for families who needed the help. He charged fair prices and worked efficiently, his reputation as a reliable laborer spreading quickly through the small community. He kept watch on the Hartwell house from a distance. In the weeks following Thomas's death, Magnus observed Clara's struggle with a mixture of admiration and concern. She took in washing and mending to earn money, her hands raw and chapped from the constant immersion in cold water and lye soap. Her children, a boy of 6 named Samuel and a girl of 4 named Annie, grew thinner as Clara stretched their food supplies to impossible limits. Magnus saw her at the general store, counting coins carefully before each purchase, her face tight with concentration and worry. She never asked for charity and held her head high despite the whispers that followed her through town. Widow woman with 2 children, and no means of support, the gossip said. She'll have to remarry soon or end up in the poorhouse. Magnus began his campaign of anonymous assistance carefully. He left split firewood stacked neatly beside Clara's back door in the early morning hours before anyone stirred. He paid her grocery bill at the general store under the pretense that Thomas had credit coming from the lumber company, convincing the shopkeeper to tell Clara the charges had been settled. He repaired loose boards on her front porch and replaced a broken window shutter, timing his work for when Clara had taken the children to Sunday services. Each act was executed with precision and discretion. Magnus told himself he was simply fulfilling an obligation to a fallen fellow worker, that any decent man would do the same. But late at night, lying on his narrow bed and listening to the wind howl through the stable below, Magnus admitted a harder truth. He thought about Clara constantly, about her quiet strength and the way she moved through grief with dignity intact, about how she read to her children every evening by lamplight, her voice carrying through the thin walls when Magnus passed by on his rounds. He thought about things he had no right to think about, and the wanting made him feel more alone than ever. The first direct interaction came on a bitter afternoon in late November. Magnus was delivering a load of firewood to the hotel when he saw Clara struggling with an overloaded basket of wet laundry. The wind had picked up, whipping the frozen garment against her body and threatening to tear the entire load from her grip. Magnus watched her fight for control, saw her slip on an icy patch and nearly fall. He was moving before conscious thought intervened, crossing the street in a few long strides. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Let me help you with that." Clara looked up at him, snowflakes catching in her hair and eyelashes. Recognition flickered across her face. "You're the man who brought news about Thomas," she said. Magnus nodded and reached for the basket. Clara hesitated, pride warring with practical necessity, then released her grip. The basket weighed perhaps 40 pounds. Nothing to Magnus, but clearly a burden for a woman of Clara's slight build. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Clara gestured toward the house 2 blocks distant. "I take in laundry for Mrs. Henderson and the boarding house," she explained. "The walk isn't usually difficult, but the ice makes everything harder." They walked together in silence, Magnus adjusting his pace to match Clara's shorter stride. The wind drove snow into their faces and made conversation nearly impossible, which suited Magnus fine. He wasn't good with words under the best circumstances. When they reached Clara's house, Magnus set the basket on the porch and turned to leave. "Mr. Thornwood," Clara said, and Magnus paused. He hadn't realized she knew his name. "Thank you, not just for this, but for the firewood, and the groceries, and the repairs." Magnus felt heat rise in his face despite the cold. "I don't know what you mean," he started to say, but Clara cut him off with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "This is a small town, Mr. Thornwood. People notice things. The shopkeeper mentioned your story about Thomas's credit, but I know my husband left no such arrangement, and I recognize the way you split wood. Thomas always said you had a distinctive technique, very precise and efficient." Magnus stood frozen, caught in his deception and unsure how to proceed. "I apologize if I overstepped," he managed finally. "I just wanted to help. I know Thomas would want his family cared for." Clara studied him for a long moment, her green eyes sharp despite the exhaustion that shadowed her features. "Why?" she asked simply. "You barely knew Thomas. You owe us nothing." Magnus struggled to articulate thoughts he'd never spoken aloud. "Because it's right," he said inadequately. "Because your children shouldn't go hungry. Because you shouldn't have to carry that burden alone." The words felt clumsy and insufficient, but they were true, and Clara seemed to hear the honesty beneath the awkward delivery. "Come inside," she said abruptly. "You must be frozen. Have coffee at least." Magnus wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the distance that kept him safe. But Clara had already opened the door, and the warmth spilling out was inviting after the bitter cold. He followed her inside, ducking his head to clear the doorframe, and feeling immediately oversized in the small front room. The house was spotlessly clean but spare, furniture worn and mended, everything speaking of careful maintenance on limited resources. Samuel and Annie sat at the kitchen table working on slate boards, practicing their letters. They looked up when Magnus entered, their eyes going wide at his size. Annie let out a small gasp and pressed closer to her brother. "Children, this is Mr. Thornwood," Clara said calmly. "He worked with your father and has been kind enough to help us. Can you say hello?" Samuel mumbled a greeting while Annie remained silent, her thumb creeping toward her mouth. Magnus lowered himself carefully into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight. Clara poured coffee from a pot on the stove and set a chip cup before him. "I apologize for not having cream or sugar," she said. "Those are luxuries we've had to forego." Magnus shook his head. "Black is perfect," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell." They sat in awkward silence for several minutes. The only sounds the ticking of a mantel clock and the scrape of chalk on slate as the children returned to their lessons. Magnus cradled the coffee cup in his massive hands, feeling it grow cool as he searched for something to say. Finally, Clara spoke. "The firewood you've been leaving has kept us warm. The groceries have kept us fed. I won't pretend I don't need the help, because clearly I do. But I can't accept charity indefinitely, Mr. Thornwood. It isn't right. Magnus set down his cup carefully. It's not charity, he said. Considerate payment of a debt. Thomas was a good man and a good worker. He helped me more than once in the camps. This is me returning the favor. Clara's expression suggested she didn't quite believe him, but was willing to accept the fiction for practicality's sake. Very well, she said. Then let me repay you in the way I can. I'll do your mending and washing. Bring me your clothes, and I'll see them properly cared for. Magnus started to protest, but Clara raised a hand. I insist, Mr. Thornwood. I won't be a burden to anyone, not even someone as kind as yourself. Pride and practicality, Magnus thought. Clara Hartwell had both in abundance. He nodded slowly. That's fair, he agreed. Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. They finished their coffee in more comfortable silence, and when Magnus rose to leave, he felt something shift in the careful walls he'd built around himself. He'd been seen, not just his actions, but his intentions, and rather than the exposure feeling dangerous, it felt almost like relief. December brought a cold snap that froze the river solid and sent temperatures plummeting to levels that made even stepping outside painful. Magnus found himself at Clara's house more frequently, always with some legitimate reason. Firewood to deliver, a loose hinge to repair, storm shutters to reinforce against the wind. Clara accepted his help with gracious efficiency and kept her end of their arrangement, mending his shirts and washing his few changes of clothes with meticulous care. A pattern developed between them, comfortable and predictable. Magnus would arrive in the early afternoon when the children were occupied with lessons or play. Clara would offer coffee and they would talk, brief exchanges that gradually lengthened into real conversations. Magnus learned that Clara had grown up in St. Louis, daughter of a schoolteacher who died when she was 15. She'd met Thomas at a church social and married him at 18, following him west with dreams of building something permanent in the new territories. She loved to read and had managed to save a small collection of books that she treasured above almost anything else. She worried constantly about her children, about providing them with education and opportunity in a place where both were scarce. She missed her husband with an ache that never fully subsided, but was learning to carry the grief like a heavy coat, something that weighed her down but no longer threatened to suffocate her entirely. Clara in turn drew out pieces of Magnus' history that he'd never shared with anyone. He'd been born in Norway, the youngest of 7 children in a family of fishermen. His size had manifested early in his father, a hard man who valued uniformity, had treated Magnus' differentness as a personal affront. By the time Magnus was 12, he stood taller than his oldest brother and possessed strength that frightened the other village children. His mother had been gentler, trying to shield him from his father's disappointment, but she died of fever when Magnus was 14. Within a year, Magnus had worked his way onto a merchant ship bound for America, trading his labor for passage to a place where maybe being different wouldn't mark him so completely. He'd drifted through various jobs in the years since, always moving when people started to stare too much or whisper too loudly. The lumber camp suited him because the work valued strength over social grace, and the isolation of the mountains meant fewer questions about why a man his size chose to live alone. I've always felt like I take up too much space, Magnus admitted one afternoon while Clara darned one of his shirts. Like the world was built for normal-sized people, and I'm just an inconvenience that everyone has to work around. Clara looked up from her stitching, her expression thoughtful. I don't find you inconvenient, she said quietly. I find you kind. And kindness matters more than size ever could. The word settled into Magnus like warmth after a long cold. He'd been called many things in his life. Strong, useful, intimidating, strange. But kind? That was new, and it made something in his chest tighten painfully. He wanted to tell Clara what her words meant, wanted to express the gratitude and something deeper that surged through him. But the words wouldn't come, trapped behind years of practiced silence. Instead, he simply nodded and looked away, blinking against an unexpected sting in his eyes. Christmas approached, and with it came increased hardship for families like the Hartwells who operated on threadbare budgets. Magnus heard Clara explain to Samuel and Annie that there wouldn't be gifts this year, that Christmas was about faith and family rather than material things. The children accepted this with the stoic resilience of those who'd learned young that life rarely provided what you wanted. Magnus couldn't bear it. He spent his carefully hoarded wages on practical gifts disguised as necessities. Warm boots for both children, claiming the lumber company had provided them for workers' families. A thick wool shawl for Clara, saying he'd won in a card game and had no use for women's clothing. A ham and preserved fruits, explaining the hotel had overstocked and was selling supplies at deep discount. Clara saw through every excuse but accepted the gifts with grace, understanding that Magnus needed the fiction as much as she needed the help. On Christmas Eve, she invited Magnus to share dinner with them. He almost refused, afraid of intruding on family time, but the hope in Samuel's eyes and the warmth in Clara's invitation made him accept. The meal was simple but filling, and afterward, they sat by the fire while Clara read aloud from A Christmas Carol. Magnus watched the firelight play across her face as she gave voice to Dickens's characters, bringing the story alive for her children. Annie had fallen asleep against Magnus' leg, her small body trustingly pressed to his, and Samuel leaned against his mother, eyes heavy but fighting to stay awake for the ending. Magnus felt something crack open inside himself, some carefully maintained defense giving way under the weight of simple domesticity. This was what he'd never allowed himself to want, what he convinced himself wasn't meant for someone like him. Connection, belonging, the easy comfort of being welcomed into a family space. When the story ended and Clara carried Annie to bed, Magnus stood to leave. "Thank you for including me tonight," he said. "It's been a long time since I spent Christmas with anyone." Clara returned from the children's room and walked him to the door. "You're welcome here anytime, Magnus," she said, using his first name for the first time. "You're not an inconvenience or an obligation. You're a friend, and friends are always welcome." Magnus stepped out into the frozen night, Clara's words echoing in his head. A friend. It should have been enough. It was more than he'd had before. But walking back to his cold room above the livery, Magnus admitted the truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. He didn't want to be Clara's friend. Or, rather, he wanted that and more. He wanted to be the one she turned to when things got hard. He wanted to watch her children grow and be part of their lives. He wanted to sit across from her every evening and hear about her day, her thoughts, her dreams. He wanted things he had no right to want from a woman still mourning her husband, a woman who'd shown him kindness, but nothing that suggested she saw him as anything beyond a helpful acquaintance. The new year arrived with a blizzard that buried Copper Ridge under 3 feet of snow. Magnus spent 2 days helping dig out the town, his strength invaluable in clearing streets and roofs. On the 3rd day, he made his way to Clara's house and found her struggling with a collapsed section of fence that had buckled under snow weight. He repaired it quickly while Clara watched from the porch, wrapped in the shawl he'd given her for Christmas. When he finished, she called him inside for coffee, and Magnus gratefully accepted, his hands numb despite heavy gloves. They sat at the kitchen table, the children napping in the next room, and Clara studied Magnus with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You've been avoiding me," she said abruptly, "since Christmas. Have I done something to offend you?" Magnus' heart seized. "No," he said quickly. "Not at all. You've been nothing but gracious." "Then what is it?" Clara pressed. "We were becoming friends, and then you pulled away. If I've misunderstood our arrangement or presumed too much, please tell me. I value honesty above almost everything." Magnus stared into his coffee cup, wrestling with whether to speak truth or retreat behind comfortable lies. Clara deserved honesty. She'd been brave enough to ask directly, and Magnus owed her the same courage. "I pulled away because being near you became difficult," he said slowly, "because I started feeling things I have no right to feel. Because every time I leave your house, I wish I didn't have to. Because when Annie falls asleep against me or Samuel asks me to show him how to stack firewood properly, I want it to be my right to teach him, not just a borrowed moment." He forced himself to look up, to meet Clara's eyes. "I'm not asking for anything, Mrs. Hartwell. I know you're still grieving Thomas, and I would never presume. But you asked for honesty, and that's the truth. Being your friend isn't enough, but it's all I can ask for. So I'm trying to accept it and failing badly." The silence that followed felt endless. Clara's expression had gone carefully neutral, revealing nothing. Magnus prepared himself for rejection, for the end of even the friendship they'd built. Then Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her fingers small and delicate against his scarred knuckles. "I'm not ready," she said quietly. "I don't know when I will be. Thomas has only been gone 3 months, and I still reach for him in the morning before I remember he's gone. But Magnus, you become important to me and to my children. You've shown us kindness when we needed it most. I can't promise you anything beyond what we have now, but I'm not asking you to leave either. Can you be patient with me while I figure out what I'm capable of feeling?" Magnus turned his hand over, carefully enfolding Clara's smaller hand in his. "I can be patient," he said. "I'm good at waiting. I've been waiting my whole life for someone to see me the way you do. I can wait longer if that's what you need." Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You're a remarkable man, Magnus Thornwood," she said. "I think Thomas would have been glad you're the one helping us. I think he would have trusted you with his family." The words released something in Magnus, some final piece of armor falling away. He felt exposed and vulnerable and more alive than he'd felt in years. And for the first time in his adult life, Magnus allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he deserved the happiness that seemed suddenly, terrifyingly possible. Spring came late to Montana Territory, the snow lingering stubbornly into April before finally surrendering to warming temperatures and longer days. Magnus had spent the winter months in a state of careful balance, maintaining his friendship with Clara while respecting the boundaries she'd established. He continued his visits, always with legitimate purpose, and gradually became a fixture in the Hartwell household. Samuel had taken to following Magnus around during his repairs, asking endless questions about tools and techniques. Annie had overcome her initial shyness and now greeted Magnus with enthusiastic hugs that made his heart ache with their unguarded affection. Clara remained cautiously warm, clearly wrestling with emotions she wasn't ready to fully acknowledge. The town had begun to notice. Copper Ridge was too small for anything to remain private for long, and Magnus' frequent presence at the widow Hartwell's house had become fodder for speculation. Most of it was harmless gossip, the usual small-town talk about whether Clara would remarry and whether the giant lumberjack was courting her. But some of it carried a harder edge. Magnus heard the whispers in the saloon, men questioning what a woman like Clara could possibly want with someone like him. Speculation that perhaps Magnus wasn't right in the head, that his size indicated something wrong with his mind as well. Suggestions that Clara was simply using him for labor and would eventually send him packing once someone more suitable came along. Magnus had weathered such talk his entire life and had learned to let it pass through him without taking root. But now it mattered because it reflected on Clara, and anything that might harm her reputation or make her life more difficult gnawed at him. He considered pulling back again, creating distance to protect her from association with someone the town viewed as oddity. But when he mentioned his concern to Clara, she'd fixed him with a look of such fierce determination that he'd fallen silent. "I don't care what small minds think," she'd said. "You've earned your place in our lives through your actions, and I won't let ignorant gossip dictate who I allow into my home." The words had warmed Magnus even as they worried him. In early May, the lumber camps reopened, and Magnus faced a decision. He could return to the mountains, to the work he knew and the isolation that had defined most of his adult life. The pay was good, and the camps would operate through October, giving him enough wages to support himself through another winter. But leaving meant months away from Clara and the children, months of wondering if someone else would step into the space he created, someone more acceptable to the town's sensibilities. The thought of return to find Clara, remarried to a shopkeeper or rancher, someone normal and appropriate, made Magnus physically ill. He delayed his decision for a week, then another, taking day labor jobs around town that paid less but kept him close. Clara noticed his hesitation and finally confronted him about it one evening after the children had gone to bed. "The camps opened 3 weeks ago," she said, without preamble. "You always go back in spring. Why are you still here?" Magnus stood at her fireplace, too large a small room, but unwilling to sit when the conversation felt this important. "Because leaving feels impossible," he admitted. "Because I don't want to miss watching Samuel learn to read, or Annie lose her next tooth. Because I don't want to come back in the fall and find you've moved on with your life in ways that don't include me." Clara rose from her chair and crossed to where Magnus stood, having to look up to meet his eyes. "Do you think I haven't noticed you're scared?" she asked gently. "Do you think I can't see how you hold yourself back, always waiting for me to decide I've had enough of you?" Magnus swallowed hard. "I'm terrified you'll leave," he said, the words coming out rough and unsteady. "I'm terrified that one day you'll wake up and realize you can do better than a man who's too big and too quiet and too different. I'm terrified that caring about you and your children has made me vulnerable in ways I can't protect myself from anymore. And I'm so scared, Clara. I'm so scared you'll leave." The admission hung between them, raw and exposed. Magnus had never voiced his deepest fear to anyone, had spent his life armoring himself against the inevitable rejection. But here, in Clara's small front room with firelight casting shadows on the walls, he'd finally spoken the truth that haunted him. Clara reached up and took Magnus' face in her hands, the gesture tender despite the awkward angle required by their height difference. "Look at me," she said firmly. Magnus met her eyes, green and clear and filled with emotion he was afraid to name. "I'm not leaving," Clara said. "I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you if I have any say in it." Magnus felt something break loose in his chest, some dam holding back months of carefully controlled emotion. His eyes filled with tears he couldn't hold back, and for the first time since his mother's death 20 years earlier, Magnus Thornwood cried. Not quietly or with dignity, but with great shuddering sobs that shook his massive frame. Clara pulled him down to her level, wrapping her arms around him as much as she could reach, and held him while he wept. She murmured soft words, nonsense comfort sounds, and didn't pull away when Magnus' tears soaked the shoulder of her dress. She simply held him, this giant of man who'd finally found someone who saw past his eyes to the lonely, frightened person beneath. When Magnus finally regained control, he pulled back, mortified by his loss of composure. "I apologize," he started, but Clara shook her head. "Don't," she said. "Don't apologize for being human. Don't apologize for feeling things deeply. It's one of the things I've come to love about you, Magnus. The way you care so much despite spending years trying to convince yourself you don't." Magnus stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "Love," he repeated. Clara smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. "I wasn't ready before," she said. "I thought I needed more time. But watching you these past months, seeing how you've loved my children and supported me without asking for anything in return, I realized something. Thomas was my first love, and I'll always carry him with me. But he's gone and I'm still here. And so are you. And I think maybe I'm ready to see what we could be together." Magnus couldn't speak. His throat had closed entirely, emotion overwhelming his capacity for words. So instead, he did what felt natural. He carefully, gently, pulled Clara close and held her, mindful of his strength but needing the contact more than his next breath. Clara relaxed into him, her head resting against his chest, and they stood that way for long minutes while the fire crackled and outside the spring wind whispered through the awakening town. "This is what I want," Magnus finally managed. "This right here. You and Samuel and Annie. A family. A home. I know I'm not much, not educated or refined, or any of the things you probably imagine for yourself, but I would spend every day trying to be worthy of you." Clara pulled back just enough to look up at him. "You already are," she said simply. "You've been worthy from the moment you showed up at my door with news about Thomas, and I saw the grief in your eyes for a man you barely knew. You've been worthy every time you split firewood in the dark, so my children wouldn't wake up cold. You've been worthy in every kindness you've shown, without expectation of return. Don't diminish what you are, Magnus. You're exactly what we need." The next weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and tentative joy. Magnus continued to maintain propriety, still keeping his own room at delivery, but spending his days at Clara's house. He took on odd jobs that allowed him to stay in town, building a reputation as a reliable handyman and carpenter. The gossip continued but gradually shifted from speculation to acceptance as people saw that Clara was genuinely happy and her children were thriving. Samuel flourished under Magnus' patient instruction, learning practical skills and gaining confidence. Annie appointed herself Magnus' shadow, following him everywhere and chattering constantly in the way of small children who decided someone was safe. In June, Magnus formally asked Clara to marry him. There was no grand gesture, no public display, just the two of them sitting on her front porch after the children had gone to bed, watching fireflies dance in the summer darkness. "I know we should probably wait longer," Magnus said, "for propriety's sake. But I don't want to wait. I want to build a life with you and make it official. I want Samuel and Annie to be mine legally as well as in my heart. I want to wake up every morning knowing I get to spend the day with you. Will you marry me, Clara?" Clara took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you. We'll face whatever comes together." Magnus released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. When he asked, Clara smiled. "Soon," she said. "I don't want to wait either." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Samuel and Annie stood up with them, beaming with excitement at officially becoming a family. The townspeople who attended were fewer than might have come for a more conventional union, but those present were genuine in their well wishes. Magnus and Clara bought a small piece of land on the outskirts of Copper Ridge and began building a house together. Magnus did most of the heavy construction, while Clara planned the layout and made it a home. Samuel helped where he could, taking pride in contributing to their new dwelling. Annie collected wildflowers and placed them in jars on the windowsills before there were even proper windows installed. The house took shape slowly through the summer and into fall, growing from foundation to frame to finished structure. It wasn't grand or elaborate, but it was solid and built with care, every board and nail placed with intention. By the time the first snow fell in November, the house was complete and the family was settled. Magnus stood in the front room one evening, watching Clara read to the children by lamplight, and felt contentment so profound it was almost frightening. This was more than he'd ever imagined having, more than he'd believed possible for someone like him. Samuel looked up and caught Magnus watching. "Pa," he said, using the name that still made Magnus' chest tighten with emotion. "Will you tell us about when you first came to America?" Annie immediately chimed in her support, and Clara smiled at Magnus with an expression of such love and acceptance that Magnus had to blink back tears again. "I was 14, Magnus began, settling into the chair that had been specially reinforced to hold his weight. "And I was very scared. But sometimes the scariest decisions lead to the best outcomes." He looked around at his family, at the home they'd built together, at the life that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. "Sometimes you have to be brave enough to let people see who you really are," he continued. "And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they'll see you and love you anyway." Clara met his eyes across the room and mouthed, "I love you." Magnus smiled, finally believing he deserved the happiness he'd found, and continued his story while outside the snow fell softly on their little house at the edge of the frontier. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel for more tales of courage, love, and the unexpected connections that change our lives. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been afraid to show your true self to someone? What gave you the courage to take that risk? Your stories matter, and I'd love to hear them. Hit that like button if Magnus and Clara's journey resonated with you, and I'll see you in the next story.